Joining us now is Ambassador Richard Murphy. He's been a former ambassador to Syria and an assistant secretary of state at the State Department in Washington. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us. When we look at what is going on right now, the United States seems to be involved in something of a balancing act right now. On the one hand, it's attacking Islamic State forces in Syria. There's been no opposition from the Syrian government. In fact, the Syrian government says it supports what the United States is doing. So on the one hand, the United States attacks Islamic State. On the other hand, it says its declared aim is to remove Bashar Al-Assad from power. How does it accomplish both goals?
Well, President Obama said back in, I think it was September, three years ago, that it was time for President Assad to step aside. Well, President Assad did not step aside, and he's not going to step aside. He is facing a serious rebellion against his authority, and the civil war continues. We have the same goal as far as ISIS is concerned. That should be ended as a threat. And the fact is, we have seen support spring up around the Arab world against ISIS. It's seen as a threat generally, and it's abhorrent in the eyes of Islamic leaders.
Is it just military force that's going to do it? Because in a sense, the United States and its allies are fighting an ideology, aren't they?
Sure. No, a military force can only be a part, and perhaps a small part, of the operation. ISIS has fed on a youth throughout the region that has been disillusioned, felt lack of respect, lack of participation in its own future, unemployed, hungry. All of these issues have to be addressed, and that's the point that President Obama made today.
And President Obama has also said that he wants to arm and train the Syrian opposition. The problem is, how does the United States identify which opposition it wants to train and arm? Because it's been a bit of a fluid situation with arms changing hands, with allegiances changing at times. That's a problem for the United States, isn't it?
It is a great problem, and it's why so relatively little has been done to date in arming the opposition. There seems to be greater confidence now, as the time has passed, in which factions we can trust, and that we're not passing arms and training people who will end up perhaps within the ranks of ISIS or the Nusra Front.
What about a role for some of the region's countries? I'm talking especially about Turkey and Iran.
They both have a role, and the extent they're ready to play it, time will tell. Turkey hesitated to be active when its consulate personnel in Mosul were still held hostages. I'm sure from what I have been hearing from Turkish friends, there is a determination to seal the border, seal their country from being used as a transit for those crossing to join the extremist factions in Iraq and Syria. So that, I think, is a given. What more they will do on the military front, time will tell. Iran has certainly played a role in encouraging the shift of leadership in Baghdad. And it is equally opposed to the version of fanatic Islam that ISIS represents. So you can say there's some common ground there. Could it lead to cooperation in other fields between the United States and Iran? I have to say time will tell. I hope so.
And the humanitarian situation in Syria, which is getting worse every day. We've just heard 130,000 people just in 3 days crossed the border into Turkey. Turkey is now hosting something like 1.5 million refugees. There's also a number of refugees who have moved to Lebanon. What can the United States do together with its allies in the Middle East as well as its allies in Europe?
Well, the doors have opened pretty much in reaching the people in need in Syria. And now it's coping with this enormous burden in Lebanon. There are more than 25% of the Lebanese population today, nearly the million mark in Turkey. The United Nations institutions are overwhelmed. Our aid groups, private non-governmental organizations, are overwhelmed. Nobody has a ready answer, and the need for generosity and for constancy of dealing with the problem is staring all of us in the eye. It's an international emergency.
Ambassador, you've been the United States representative, the ambassador in Syria. You've also worked at the State Department, as we mentioned, as Assistant Secretary of State. There is lots of talk now about looking for a political solution, a diplomatic solution to this. Are you confident that there is a political or diplomatic solution?
I don't think, put it this way, there's no military solution. So what does that leave you? A political and diplomatic solution, or a political solution arrived at through diplomacy? We had hopes that Geneva I, that Geneva II would be the key to that door. It has not worked yet. But that door has to be opened, and the people have to find their way to the table. We spent a great deal of energy, if you will, diplomatically for the past 3 years, trying to bring the Syrian political opponents together to present a viable platform for a choice by the Syrian people between the regime and the opposition. It hasn't worked, as we've tried to bring a greater measure of unity among the 150 military factions that are operating in Syria on the rebel side. But, you know, it just could be that this crisis over ISIS and the decision to punch at ISIS will make people realize the need for coming to a political solution more broadly in Syria.
Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to have to leave it there. That was Ambassador Richard Murphy, a former ambassador to Syria, talking to us about the escalating crisis in that country. We'll have much more coming up. You're watching The Heat.